They scanned Florida from orbit and laughed. Swampy, slow, weak, no real defenses, the perfect first strike. What they did not scan was the alligators, the black bears, or the man the internet simply calls Florida man. Before the sun even came up, their first landing pod would already be missing 2 soldiers and gaining a very confused alligator. If you love a wild alien invasion story, hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight. Now let's step into the swamp, because the real invasion hasn't even started yet. 400 light-years away, aboard a command vessel shaped like a curved black blade, High Commander Craxus of the Threshold Fleet stared down at a glowing blue and green planet on his tactical display. His scanning officer, a thin gray creature named Avril, floated beside him with a data slate in his claws. "Report," Craxus said. "Target selected, Commander. Continent North America." "Region the peninsula designated Florida." Avril tapped the slate. "Low elevation, warm climate, minimal mountain cover, population spread thin across small towns. Weapons detected are mostly civilian firearms and fishing equipment." Craxus narrowed his 4 eyes. "Fishing equipment?" "Yes, Commander." The scans also flagged something called Florida Man as a recurring pattern in their communication networks. "Our translators are unsure if it refers to one individual or a species." Craxus dismissed this with a wave of his hand. He had conquered the ice fields of Threll, the floating cities of Baxos Minor, and the fortress moons of the Haven Combine. A soft, humid peninsula full of retirees and beaches did not concern him. What his scanners had failed to properly measure was the actual wildlife of the region. The sensors registered alligators simply as large reptiles, low threat, cold-blooded, slow-moving. They registered black bears as omnivorous mammals, moderate threat, generally avoidant of humans. Neither category accounted for a bear raiding a campsite for snacks, or an alligator that had learned humans sometimes carried food and occasionally did not. The scanners also completely failed to register hurricane season instincts baked into every local, an instinct that made Floridians treat any strange event, falling sky included, as something you filmed first and reacted to second. Down on the surface, in a small town called Cypress Hollow, tucked between a slow-moving river and a stretch of thick mangrove swamp, nobody had any idea their planet had just been circled in red on an alien tactical map. It was late in hurricane season, humid enough that the air felt like a wet towel, and most of the town was doing exactly what it always did after dark. The gas station was slow. The Waffle House on Route 9 was steady with truckers and third-shift workers. And out on the water, a man named Walt Dawson was running his airboat along the river, checking his gator lines with a flashlight clenched in his teeth. Walt had been running airboat tour and nuisance gator removal for almost 20 years. He had pulled 12-foot alligators out of swimming pools, out of golf course ponds, and once out of a church baptismal tank that nobody wanted to talk about afterward. He was not a man who startled easily, so when a strange orange light streaked low over the tree line and vanished into the swamp about a mile ahead, Walt did not call the police first. He grabbed his spotlight, cut his engine down to an idle, and went to go look because in Florida, weird lights in the swamp usually meant either a downed drone, a meth lab explosion, or a really good story for the bar later. What Walt did not know was that the light was an alien reconnaissance pod, and its 4 occupants had just landed directly inside gator territory during peak feeding hours. The pod's hatch hissed open with a soft mechanical whine. 4 Threshold Fleet scouts stepped out onto the muddy bank, wearing sleek matte black armor designed for stealth insertions on 100 different worlds. Their leader, a scout named Varric, raised a scanning device and swept it across the tree line. "No structures detected," Varric said through the translator. "No hostile signatures nearby. This region appears undefended." Behind him, one of the younger scouts crouched near the water's edge, curious about the strange, dark shapes floating just beneath the surface. He extended a gloved hand toward what he assumed was a harmless log. The log opened its mouth. By the time Walt's spotlight beam swept across the bank, one alien scout was already backpedaling through the mud, screaming in a language no translator had prepared for. Because there is no polite word in any galactic tongue, for an 11-foot alligator clamping down on your boot. Walt killed his idol completely and just floated there for a second, watching 4 glowing green figures in strange armor scatter in 4 different directions, while something large and scaly thrashed in the shallows behind them. Walt reached for his radio. "Dispatch," he said slowly. "You're gonna want to send somebody out to the Cypress Hollow Bend. I think I just found something that ain't from around here." Nobody on the other end believed him, not yet. But 300 feet away, hidden in the reeds, the second alien scout was quietly recording everything, and back on the command ship. High Commander Craxus was about to receive the first status report of the invasion. It would not be the report he was expecting, and it would be the first sign that Florida had never once appeared on any properly written invasion manual, for very, very good reasons. The report reached Craxus 12 minutes later, delivered by a visibly shaken communications officer. "Commander, the recon team has encountered resistance." Craxus turned from the tactical display. "What kind of resistance? Military, automated defense?" "Unclear, sir." Scout Varick's audio feed recorded what he described as, quote, "a submerged predator with no visible tactical purpose." Craxus stared at the officer for a long moment. "A predator?" "Yes, Commander." Scout Terran sustained damage to his lower leg armor. The unit retreated into thick vegetation and has gone silent. This was, in the long history of the Threshold Fleet, the first documented case of a reconnaissance mission failing due to Reptile. Craxus did not know that yet. He assumed sabotage, an ambush, perhaps early warning systems he had somehow missed. He ordered a second, larger team down to secure the area and retrieve the first. Back on the ground, Walt Dawson had already called his cousin Denny, who ran the bait shop, and Denny had already called the county sheriff. A broad-shouldered man named Sheriff Roy Tanner, who had spent 31 years in Cypress Hollow, and had personally seen every strange thing this county had to offer. Up to and including a man who once tried to fight a vending machine on live television. Sheriff Tanner arrived at the boat ramp still buttoning his uniform shirt, expecting a meth cook gone wrong or maybe a drunk boater. What he found instead was Walt standing at the edge of his airboat, pointing his flashlight at a scorched patch of mud, a torn piece of strange black armor plating, and a trail of drag marks leading straight into the swamp. "Walt," Tanner said carefully, "you been drinking tonight?" "Sheriff, I have been dead sober since Tuesday, and I am telling you whatever that thing was, it was not a person. And it was not local." Before Tanner could respond, the second alien team dropped from the sky nearly 400 yards downriver, using proper stealth thrusters this time. 6 armored soldiers fanned out through the mangroves, their leader, a broad-shouldered soldier named Dresek, holding a plasma rifle across his chest. "Locate the missing unit," Dresek ordered. "Minimal contact with locals. We do not yet understand their capabilities." What Dresek's scanners still did not properly register was the black bear that had wandered into the area 2 hours earlier, drawn by the smell of an overturned cooler near a fishing camp. Florida black bears are generally shy animals. They avoid people, avoid noise, and prefer to be left alone. They do not, however, appreciate strange armored figures walking directly toward them while carrying glowing weapons that smell like burning ozone. When one of Dresek's soldiers rounded a thick cypress tree and nearly stepped on a 400-pound black bear mid-meal, the bear did not run. The bear stood up. It is worth noting that nothing in the entire Threshold Fleet combat manual prepares a soldier for a wall of muscle and claws standing 8 feet tall in near total darkness, roaring loud enough to rattle the leaves. The soldier fired on instinct, missed completely, and then found himself airborne, thrown 15 feet into a patch of saw palmetto by a single swipe. The rest of the squad opened fire on the tree line, hitting nothing but bark and Spanish moss, while their sensors screamed contradictory readings about an unidentified large mammalian threat with what the system classified, almost apologetically, as extreme close-range hostility. Dresek shouted for his team to regroup, but by then Sheriff Tanner and Walt had both heard the gunfire, or what sounded like gunfire, echoing across the water. Tanner grabbed the radio off his belt. "All units, this is Tanner. I need backup out at the Cypress Hollow Bend, and I need it now." I don't know what we're dealing with, but there's shooting, there's screaming, and Walt here says it ain't human. Word moves fast in a small Florida town. Faster than any government agency could ever manage. Within 20 minutes, 3 deputies, 2 off-duty game wardens, and Denny from the bait shop with his old deer rifle were all rolling toward the swamp. What none of them expected to find, parked quietly in a clearing behind the tree line, was the massive dark shape of an alien landing craft, its ramp still down. Lights blinking along its hull like nothing that belonged anywhere near Florida soil. Sheriff Tanner stopped his truck, stepped out, and stared up at it in complete silence for almost 10 full seconds. "Well," he finally said, loud enough for everyone behind him to hear, "I reckon we're gonna need more than the bait shop for this one." Somewhere behind him, a low growl rumbled through the trees, followed by a splash from the river that sounded a lot larger than any fish. Tanner slowly turned his flashlight toward the water, and what floated there, watching with 2 dark eyes just above the surface, made even the sheriff take one careful step back. By dawn, High Commander Craxus had lost contact with both his scouting teams and 1 full soldier from the 2nd Unit. This was, statistically, the worst first 6 hours of any invasion in Threshold Fleet history, and it had happened without a single organized human defense force firing a shot. Craxus ordered a full tactical review, and what came back only confused him further. "Explain to me," Craxus said to Avril, "how a reconnaissance team was disabled by wildlife before making contact with a single armed human." Avril adjusted the data slate nervously. "The predator encountered by Scout Varick has been identified as a species called the American alligator. Cold-blooded ambush predator, generally regarded by locals as a minor nuisance. A minor nuisance disabled one of my scouts. There is also the matter of the large mammal that engaged the 2nd team. Local records refer to it simply as a black bear." Craxus rubbed the ridge above his eyes. "And the humans themselves, have any of them engaged our forces directly?" "Only tangentially, Commander." A local law enforcement officer and several armed civilians arrived at the landing site approximately 40 minutes ago. They have not attacked. They appear to be observing. This was true. Sheriff Tanner had ordered his people to hold position at a safe distance, partly out of caution, and partly because nobody, not even a 31-year veteran of Florida law enforcement, had any protocol on file for approaching a spacecraft. Walt Dawson, however, had never been a patient man, and while the deputies argued about jurisdiction and whether the Coast Guard or the National Guard should be called first, Walt quietly climbed back into his airboat, cut the engine, and used the current to drift silently along the far side of the landing craft, flashlight off, phone camera on. Because if nobody was going to believe this story later, he intended to have proof. What Walt did not expect was the fully armed alien commander stepping out of the tree line directly in front of him, catching his boat's silhouette against the moonlight on the water. Dresek raised his weapon. "Halt! Identify yourself!" Walt raised both hands slowly, flashlight still in one of them. "Buddy, I run Gator Tour for a living. I don't even know what you are, let alone what you want." Dresek studied him through his visor display, translating the words with a slight delay. "You are unarmed? I got a boat hook and a very disappointed expression, that's about it." From the swamp behind Dresek, a low, wet, dragging sound approached the bank, slow and deliberate. Dresek's sensors registered a large heat signature closing in from the water, and for the first time since landing on this planet, he took an actual step backward. "What is that?" Dresek said. Walt didn't even turn his flashlight toward the water. He didn't need to. "That, friend, is old Mossback, and he has lived in this bend longer than the county has had paved roads." "I'd start walking backward a little faster if I was you." Dresek did not walk. Dresek ran, and old Mossback, a 14-foot alligator who had absolutely no interest in geopolitics, but a very strong interest in anything that moved suddenly near his territory, surged out of the water with the kind of speed that makes people forget alligators are supposedly slow. Dresek's team opened fire wildly into the dark, hitting the mud, hitting a cypress tree, and hitting absolutely nothing that resembled their actual target. While their commander scrambled back toward the landing craft, radio crackling with a request that no officer in Threshold Fleet history had ever been forced to make. This is Dresek requesting immediate reinforcement. Ground team is compromised. Repeat, ground team is compromised by local reptilian wildlife. Aboard the command ship, Craxus received the transmission in stunned silence. Around him, the bridge crew exchanged uneasy glances. This was supposed to be the easiest region on the entire planet to secure. Instead, in less than 8 hours, 2 full scouting units had been effectively neutralized, not by weapons, not by soldiers, but by an alligator and a bear. Craxus made a decision that would define the rest of this campaign. He ordered the main invasion force forward, 3 full battalions, ground vehicles, and air support, landing at first light across 3 separate targets. A strategy meant to overwhelm any local resistance before it could organize. What Craxus still failed to understand, and what none of his scans could ever properly measure, was that Florida had never once needed an organized resistance. It simply needed enough time for word to spread, and by sunrise, half the county already knew something had landed in the swamp. And Sheriff Tanner's radio had not stopped ringing since 4 in the morning. "They're coming back," Tanner said grimly, watching the horizon lighten from his truck. "And this time there's a lot more of them." Behind him, Walt climbed out of his airboat, soaking wet, grinning despite himself. "Good," he said, "because I already called my buddies at the tackle shop. And they are bringing every airboat in this county." The first wave of Threshold Fleet troop carriers descended just after 7 in the morning, splitting into 3 separate landing zones exactly as Craxus had ordered. One touched down near a public boat ramp crowded with early morning fishermen. One landed directly beside a roadside diner called Peggy's Waffle Stop, packed with truckers finishing their coffee before a shift change. The third and worst possible choice on the entire peninsula touched down in an open field beside the Cypress Hollow Senior Living Community, where 42 residents were already outside for their 7 a.m. water aerobics class. At the boat ramp, soldiers marched out expecting to secure the waterfront and establish a forward position. What they found instead was roughly 30 airboats, John boats, and bass fishing rigs already circling the shoreline, engines roaring, spotlights blazing. Every single one of them carrying men and women who had heard about the swamp incident overnight, and had shown up expecting either a wild alligator story, or, at the very least, a very good excuse to skip work. When the alien squad leader raised a weapon and announced through a translator that the area was now under Threshold authority, a bass boat captain named Cooter Prout leaned out over his windshield and yelled back, loud enough for the whole ramp to hear, "Buddy, I skipped my shift at the plant for this, you better be worth it." The response from the squad was immediate and defensive, plasma fire scorching across the water, missing every boat by a wide margin, because none of the pilots held still long enough to be an easy target. What followed was less an organized counterattack, and more 40 different Florida men and women doing whatever instinct told them to do, which mostly involved ramming their boats directly at the shoreline, grabbing tackle boxes, boat hooks, and in one memorable case, an entire cooler of frozen bait, and throwing everything they had at the confused soldiers scrambling across the mud. At Peggy's Waffle Stop, the situation escalated even faster. The lead soldier, a stern officer named Haver, ordered his squad to secure the building and use the civilians inside as leverage. He had clearly never met Peggy herself, a 60-year-old woman with steel gray hair and forearms built from 30 years of flipping hash browns, who met the squad at her own front door holding a cast iron skillet like it was a family heirloom, because it was. "You are now prisoners of the Threshold Fleet," Haver announced. Peggy looked at the scorch mark already forming on her welcome mat. "Son, you just burned my doormat, and I have not even poured your coffee yet." The truckers inside did not wait for further instructions. A man named Dale Hutchins, who had been driving overnight routes for 11 years and had exactly 0 patience left in his body, grabbed a syrup bottle in each hand and started throwing them like grenades, while Peggy advanced on Haver with her skillet raised high enough that even his translator struggled to properly convey the tone of her voice. Within 4 minutes, 3 soldiers were unconscious in a puddle of spilled coffee and pancake batter. One had fled through the drive-through window, and Haver himself was pinned against his own ship's ramp being lectured by Peggy about the proper way to knock on a door. But the true disaster for Craxus unfolded at the senior living community. His soldiers marched onto the lawn expecting an easy, undefended target, only to find 42 retirees in swimsuits and pool noodles staring back at them with the particular unbothered calm of people who had already survived several hurricanes, 2 recessions, and at least 1 bad HOA meeting. Their leader, a sharp-eyed woman named Alina Whitfield, who had spent 30 years as a high school principal before retiring, stepped forward without a hint of fear. "Young man," she said to the lead soldier, "we are in the middle of water aerobics and you are blocking the sun." The soldier hesitated, clearly unprepared for a target that refused to register the threat he represented. "You will comply with threshold authority." Alina turned to the pool. "Ladies, gentlemen, I believe we have some rude company." Within seconds, pool noodles were being swung like batons, wet towels snapped through the air. And one particularly fearless resident named Harold, age 83, drove his motorized scooter directly into the back of a soldier's legs, at a surprising speed for a man who claimed he could barely walk to the mailbox. High above, Craxus watched fragmented reports pour in from all 3 landing zones, each one stranger and more humiliating than the last. Fishermen, waitresses, and retirees were somehow outmaneuvering trained soldiers, not through weapons or strategy, but through sheer unwillingness to be intimidated. Craxus slammed his fist against the console. "Send Dressek's reserve unit to the senior facility immediately." Avril hesitated. "Commander, there is another concern." "What now?" "Local wildlife reports indicate a large predator has entered the boat ramp combat zone, on the ground." Cooter Prout's boat lurched sideways as something enormous surfaced beside him, and he grinned wide enough to show every missing tooth. "Well, hey there, buddy," he shouted at the nearest alien soldier, pointing toward the water. "I'd say your day's about to get a whole lot worse." The alligator that surfaced beside Cooter's boat was nearly 13 feet long, and it had absolutely no interest in the Threshold Fleet's chain of command. It simply saw movement, heard splashing, and reacted the way every apex predator in that river had reacted for millions of years. One soldier, retreating toward the water's edge to avoid incoming tackle boxes, found himself suddenly airborne, then very quickly underwater, then scrambling back onto dry land faster than any combat simulation had ever trained him to move. His squad mates, watching this unfold, made the collective decision that the boat ramp was no longer a viable objective, and began falling back toward their landing craft in a retreat that could generously be described as undisciplined. At Peggy's waffle stop, Haver's remaining soldiers fared no better. Word had spread down the highway, and now a small convoy of pickup trucks was arriving from every direction, drawn by texts, radio chatter, and a viral video Walt Dawson had posted at 3 in the morning that had somehow already been viewed 11,000 times. Men climbed out of trucks carrying tow chains, bolt cutters, and in one case, an entire fishing net meant for tarpon, which turned out to work remarkably well on a fleeing soldier trying to reach the landing craft. Peggy stood in her doorway, coffee pot in one hand, skillet in the other, directing traffic like she had done this exact thing 100 times before, which, in a way, 30 years of a rowdy trucker crowd had prepared her for. "Somebody get that one before he reaches the ramp," she shouted, pointing her skillet at a fleeing soldier. "And nobody, I repeat nobody, is leaving without paying their tab first," at the senior community. Alina Whitfield had organized her fellow residents with the same precision. She once used to run a school of 1,100 teenagers. Pool noodles became makeshift barriers, walkers became surprisingly effective battering tools, and Harold's scooter had somehow become the single most feared vehicle on the entire battlefield. A fact that would earn him a standing ovation at the community's next monthly potluck. The reserve unit Craxus sent as backup arrived expecting reinforcement duty, and instead found their own comrades already being herded toward the tree line by a wall of determined retirees who, frankly, had absolutely nothing left to lose, and every afternoon free to prove it. High above, Craxus watched his tactical display fill with retreating markers across all 3 landing zones. He turned to Avril, his voice flat with disbelief. "Casualty report? No fatalities, Commander, but significant equipment loss and morale damage. Several soldiers are refusing to redeploy without what they are calling proper wildlife countermeasures. Craxus made one final attempt to salvage the operation. Ordering a massive holographic projection above Cypress Hollow itself, his own face stretched 300 feet across the morning sky, broadcasting to the entire town at once. People of this region, his voice boomed, translated instantly into English, your resistance is meaningless. Surrender now, and you will be treated with mercy. Sheriff Tanner, standing in the town square surrounded by a growing crowd of armed, soaking wet, thoroughly unimpressed locals, looked up at the enormous glowing face and shook his head slowly. Buddy, Tanner called out, loud enough for the hologram's audio pickup to catch. You flew a spaceship into Gator Country, tried to rob a diner during breakfast rush, and picked a fight with a bunch of retirees doing water aerobics. Ain't nobody here surrendering to you. The crowd erupted into laughter and applause. Somewhere behind them, an alligator that had been quietly observing from the drainage canal let out a low bellow, almost as if adding its own opinion to the matter. And the hologram flickered uncertainly. Craxus's projected face frozen mid-sentence as his own bridge crew scrambled to explain why the situation had somehow gotten worse in real time. By early afternoon, every remaining threshold soldier on the ground had been captured, chased off, or, in 3 unfortunate cases, treed by the exact same black bear that had started the whole ordeal the night before, now thoroughly annoyed at having its territory disturbed twice in 12 hours. Craxus stood in silence on his bridge, staring down at a peninsula that had defeated 3 full battalions without a single organized human military response, and gave the order every officer in the Threshold fleet would come to know by reputation alone. Pull everyone back. We are leaving this region. By sundown, the last Threshold fleet transport lifted off from Cypress Hollow, its hull dented, scorched, and in one section still faintly smelling of pancake syrup. The townspeople gathered along the riverbank to watch it go, some cheering, some simply exhausted, and Walt Dawson stood near his airboat filming the whole thing on his phone. Still not entirely sure anyone back home was going to believe what had happened over the last 18 hours. Aboard the retreating command ship, High Commander Craxus sat in silence while Avril carefully entered the day's events into the official Threshold fleet database. Craxus had conquered ice fields, floating cities, and fortress moons, and none of it had prepared him for a swamp, a diner, and a group of retirees in swimsuits. He thought about the alligator that took down his best scout within the first hour. He thought about the bear that treed 3 of his soldiers without firing a single shot back. He thought about a woman named Peggy, wielding a skillet like a ceremonial weapon, and an old man on a scooter who had, according to the final incident report, personally disabled 2 combat units. Classification, Craxus finally said. Avril looked up. Sir, this region, how should we log it? Avril hesitated, then typed carefully. Planet Earth, region Florida. Status, do not invade under any circumstances. Primary threats identified, alligators, black bears, armed civilians, retired persons, and an unidentified variable referred to locally as Florida man. Avril paused. Should I include a note about the reptile encountered by Scout Varric? Craxus closed his eyes. Yes. Note that it apparently remembers us. Back on the ground, Cypress Hollow did what Cypress Hollow always did after something wild happened. It threw a cookout. Peggy reopened the diner that same evening, patched up the scorch mark on her doormat with a strip of duct tape, and served free coffee to anyone who had helped chase off a soldier, which turned out to be most of the town. Sheriff Tanner gave a short statement to a very confused pair of reporters from the regional news station, choosing his words carefully. We had an incident, Tanner said, and the community responded the way this community always responds. That's really all I can say about it. Eleanor Whitfield's water aerobics class became something of local legend, and Harold Scooter was later spotted with a small hand-painted sign taped to the back that simply read, Ask me about the invasion. Cooter Prout posted his footage online along with the caption, Y'all would not believe my Tuesday. And by the next morning, it had more views than anything else posted from that entire county in the last 5 years. Old Mossback, the alligator who started it all, was seen the following week sunning himself in his usual spot along the bend, utterly indifferent to his newfound fame, which Walt found to be the most Florida detail of the entire story. Weeks later, satellites and scientists who studied the strange scorch marks left behind in the swamp could never quite explain what had happened out there. And the government's official response remained vague enough to frustrate everyone involved. But in Cypress Hollow, nobody needed an official explanation. They had lived it. They had chased it off with airboats, syrup bottles, pool noodles, and a 14-foot alligator who had absolutely no idea he had become a local hero. Somewhere out past the edge of the solar system, deep inside a threshold fleet archive that few would ever access again, a single planetary entry remained permanently sealed. A quiet warning passed down to every future commander who might one day consider testing their luck against a small, humid peninsula full of swamps, diners, retirees, and something the files simply referred to, without further explanation, as Florida Man. And down on the ground, life carried on exactly the way it always had. The coffee kept brewing at Peggy's. The gators kept sunning themselves in the same bend of the river. And somewhere on a bass boat, Cooter Proot raised a can of soda toward the empty sky and said, with the kind of confidence only Florida could produce, "Come on back anytime." We'll be right here. If you enjoyed this one, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next invasion story. Drop a comment below telling me which character was your favorite. And share this video with a friend who needs a good laugh tonight. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.